It was a chilly Tuesday evening, and the small diner on the corner of Maple Street was buzzing with its usual after-work crowd. Among the clatter of plates and the hum of quiet conversations, Emily moved briskly between the tables. A waitress by trade and a dreamer by heart, Emily had always believed in kindness, no matter how hard life got. She wore a weary smile as she refilled coffee cups and balanced trays, but her eyes held a warmth that could light up even the darkest of days. Outside the diner, the world seemed colder. Winter was creeping in, and the streets were unforgiving, especially for those without a place to call home. Among them was a man named Joe, a familiar figure to anyone who passed this part of town. Wrapped in a tattered coat with eyes that carried stories no one cared to ask about, Joe spent his days seeking shelter and his nights hoping for a little warmth, if not in temperature, then in human connection. Emily had noticed Joe before, often sitting on the bench across the street. He never begged, never asked for anything. He just sat there, as if waiting for life to throw him a lifeline. Tonight, though, something was different. Joe wasn't on the bench. He was standing by the diner's window, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared longingly at the food inside. Emily's heart sank. She had grown up in tough circumstances and knew what hunger felt like, the kind that gnawed at your stomach and made the world seem a little darker. As she served another customer, her eyes kept drifting back to Joe. The longer she watched him, the harder it became to ignore the tug at her conscience. Finally, during a brief lull, she grabbed a plate of leftover pancakes from a table that had just cleared. The food was still warm, and she knew it would mean the world to someone like Joe. Without thinking twice, she stepped outside, the cold air biting her cheeks. "Here," she said softly, handing the plate to Joe. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he looked like he didn't believe her. "For me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. Everyone deserves a warm meal, no strings attached. Joe's hands trembled as he accepted the plate. He muttered a quiet thank you, but the gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. Emily watched as he found a corner to sit and eat, savoring every bite as if it were a feast fit for royalty. Inside the diner, however, not everyone shared Emily's compassion. Her boss, Mr. Green, had been watching the entire exchange through the window. Known for his strict rules and zero tolerance for what he called charity on company time, he stormed into the kitchen, his face red with anger. "Emily," he barked, loud enough to make the other waitstaff pause mid-step. "What do you think you're doing? Feeding a homeless man with food from my diner? Do you think we're running a soup kitchen?" Emily froze. She had known there might be consequences, but the harshness of his words stung more than she expected. "I just couldn't ignore him, Mr. Green. He was hungry, and it was leftover food." "I don't care," Mr. Green snapped, cutting her off. "Rules are rules. Pack your things. You're done here." The diner fell silent. All eyes were on Emily as she tried to process what had just happened. Fired. For helping someone in need? She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the lump in her throat made it impossible to speak. With trembling hands, Emily untied her apron and grabbed her belongings. She cast one last glance at Joe, who was still eating outside, blissfully unaware of the storm her small act of kindness had caused. As she stepped out into the cold night, her mind raced. She felt a mix of anger, sadness, and a tinge of doubt. Had she done the right thing? Was it worth losing her job over? But just as she was about to walk away, headlights cut through the darkness, and a sleek black car pulled up in front of the diner. The driver's door opened, and a man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped out. His presence was commanding, and he seemed out of place in this modest part of town. Without a word, he glanced at Emily, then at the diner, and then at Joe, who was finishing his meal. There was something in his expression, a blend of curiosity and purpose, that made Emily stop in her tracks. Who was this man? And why did it feel like the night was far from over? Emily stood frozen on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the crisp night air. The man who stepped out of the car exuded an air of importance that seemed to draw attention even from passing strangers. He adjusted his suit jacket, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement as he walked toward the diner's door. For a moment, she wondered if he was a customer, someone there to meet a client or grab a late-night coffee. But then his gaze shifted to her, lingering for a fraction longer than felt casual. His expression was calm but unreadable, like he already knew more about her than he should. Emily's grip on her bag tightened as her heart thumped in her chest. Inside, the diner buzzed back to life. Conversations picked up again, and the clinking of cutlery filled the room, but Emily remained outside, unsure of what to do. Should she leave? Should she wait and see what this man was about? Her instincts told her that whatever was happening, it wasn't something she could just walk away from. Joe, oblivious to the sudden shift in atmosphere, had finished the last bite of his food and was now sitting with his head bowed, as though lost in thought. Emily glanced at him and felt a flicker of reassurance. No matter how chaotic the situation felt, she knew she had done the right thing by helping him. Inside the diner, Mr. Green had returned to barking orders at the staff, clearly eager to move past the incident. The suited man entered without hesitation, his movements smooth and purposeful. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped in, but unlike other customers, he didn't head for a table or the counter. Instead, he walked straight up to Mr. Green. Emily couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the way Mr. Green's face shifted. His usual bluster was replaced with something almost resembling unease. He wiped his hands on his apron nervously, nodding as the man spoke. Outside, Emily felt her curiosity growing stronger. Who was this man? He didn't look like a health inspector or a city official, but he carried himself with an authority that made even someone as stubborn as Mr. Green fall quiet. The exchange inside didn't last long. After a few minutes, the suited man turned on his heel and walked back out, his eyes immediately landing on Emily. He approached her slowly, his expression softening slightly as he got closer. "Miss," he began, his voice deep but kind, "are you Emily?" She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I'm Emily." "I saw what you did back there," he said, gesturing subtly toward Joe. "You helped someone in need, even when it cost you your job. That kind of kindness is rare these days." Emily wasn't sure how to respond. She glanced down at her hands, unsure if this was praise or the prelude to something else entirely. "I apologize if I'm catching you off guard," the man continued, "but I believe actions like yours deserve recognition, not punishment." Her brow furrowed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cautious. The man offered a small smile, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a sleek business card. "My name is Richard Warren," he said, handing her the card. "I'm the founder of a foundation that focuses on uplifting individuals and communities. We believe in paying kindness forward, especially when it's done selflessly." Emily stared at the card, the embossed gold lettering gleaming under the dim streetlights. She had heard of the Warren Foundation before, an organization that had made headlines for its philanthropic work across the city. They'd funded homeless shelters, educational programs, and even small businesses. "I don't understand," she said, looking back up at him. "Why are you here?" Richard's expression grew thoughtful. "Let's just say I have a habit of keeping an eye on stories like yours. A friend of mine was in the diner earlier tonight and called me as soon as they saw what happened. I wanted to see it for myself." Emily felt a mix of emotions, confusion, hope, and a lingering weariness. This felt too surreal, too sudden. People like Richard Warren didn't just show up on street corners offering help. "I'm not looking for anything," she said firmly, handing the card back. "I didn't do it for attention or a reward. I just couldn't let him go hungry." Richard didn't take the card back. Instead, he tucked it into her bag with a quick, practiced motion. "I know," he said simply. "That's what makes it even more remarkable. You acted purely out of compassion. But sometimes, Emily, those small acts have ripple effects far greater than you can imagine." Before she could respond, he turned his attention to Joe, who had been watching the interaction with mild curiosity. Richard walked over and crouched down to meet Joe at eye level. "Sir," he said gently, "my name is Richard Warren. What's yours?" Joe looked hesitant at first, but something about Richard's tone seemed to put him at ease. "Joe," he replied after a moment. "Joe," Richard repeated with a nod. "It's nice to meet you. I wanted to let you know that someone saw you tonight. Not just Emily, but others too. Your story matters, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." Joe's eyes flickered with a mix of suspicion and hope. "Help? What kind of help?" Richard smiled softly. "A fresh start, a warm place to sleep, maybe even a job if that's something you're interested in. No strings attached." Joe's shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of the offer was almost too much to bear. He glanced at Emily, who gave him an encouraging nod, then back at Richard. "I don't know what to say," Joe admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now," Richard said. "Just think about it. We can talk more tomorrow." As Richard stood, he turned back to Emily. "You too, Emily. I'd like to discuss an opportunity for you, something that might make this night feel a little less unfair." Emily's heart raced. She wanted to believe him, but the day's events had left her drained and skeptical. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Richard's smile grew slightly. "One that lets you keep helping people, but on a much bigger scale." Before she could press him further, the sound of the diner's door opening interrupted the moment. Mr. Green stepped out, his face a mix of irritation and confusion. "What's going on out here?" he demanded, glaring at Richard and then at Emily. Richard turned to face him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Just a conversation," he said simply. Mr. Green scoffed. "Well, I don't know who you think you are, but you're loitering on private property. Emily's not an employee here anymore, so I suggest you all move along." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp envelope. "Actually," he said, his tone cool but firm, "I just had a chat with your landlord. This diner, as of 30 minutes ago, is under new management." Mr. Green's jaw dropped. "What? You can't?" "Oh, but I can," Richard interrupted, handing him the envelope. "You'll find all the details in here. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position. Have a good night, Mr. Green." Emily watched in stunned silence as Mr. Green sputtered, trying and failing to form a coherent response. He eventually stormed back inside, slamming the door behind him. Richard turned back to Emily, his expression softening again. "Like I said," he told her, "kindness has ripple effects." The weight of the moment hit her all at once. She wasn't sure whether to laugh, cry, or simply thank him. Before she could decide, Richard gestured toward his car. "Now let's talk about what comes next." Emily hesitated before following Richard toward the sleek black car. Everything felt surreal, like she'd stumbled into someone else's story. A few hours ago, she had been serving coffee and sandwiches, going through the motions of her routine. Now, her entire world seemed to be turning upside down. Joe trailed behind them cautiously, his weathered face reflecting the same disbelief Emily felt. The interior of the car was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Richard gestured for them to sit, but Joe lingered at the door, shifting nervously. "I'm not used to places like this," Joe muttered, his voice barely audible. Richard smiled kindly. "It's just a car, Joe. Don't let it intimidate you. Come on in. We've got a lot to talk about." Reluctantly, Joe slid into the seat beside Emily, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as though he expected the car to vanish beneath him. Emily stole a glance at him, her heart aching for the quiet dignity he carried despite his struggles. Richard climbed in last and shut the door with a soft click. The moment the engine purred to life, he turned to face them, his sharp eyes studying their expressions. "Before we go any further, I want you both to understand something," he began. "What happened tonight wasn't just about feeding someone or losing a job. It was about choices. choices that define who we are and the world we want to create. Emily nodded, though her mind was still racing. I didn't think it would turn into all this, she admitted. I just couldn't let him go hungry. It felt wrong. And that's exactly why we're here, Richard said. The world needs more people like you, Emily. People who act on what's right, even when it's not easy. But kindness alone isn't enough. It needs support, a foundation to grow from. That's where I come in. Emily leaned back, trying to process his words. She wasn't sure what kind of foundation he was offering, but the sincerity in his voice was hard to ignore. What exactly are you saying? She asked. Richard glanced out the window for a moment before replying. I'm saying that tonight is the beginning of something bigger for both of you. But first, I need to know more about your stories. Joe shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Richard and the window. My story's nothing special, he mumbled. Just a lot of bad luck, bad choices, and here I am. Emily frowned, sensing the weight behind his words. She'd seen glimpses of the pain he carried, but hearing him acknowledge it made it feel more real. Everyone has a story, she said gently, and every story matters, Joe. Joe met her gaze briefly before looking away. I used to have a job, he said after a pause. A home, a family. Things were good for a while, but life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you. Their room was small but clean, with 2 neatly made beds and a window that overlooked the city's skyline. Joe lingered near the door, his hands in his pockets as he took in the unfamiliar space. Emily set her bag down and sat on the edge of one of the beds, her mind racing. This is a lot, Joe said finally, breaking the silence. I don't know what to think. Me neither, Emily admitted. She looked down at the envelope again, her fingers tracing the edges. But maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight. Let's just get some rest and see what tomorrow brings. Joe nodded, though his expression remained guarded. He sat on the other bed, his shoulders hunched. Emily could see the tension in his posture, the way he seemed ready to bolt at any moment. As the night wore on, sleep didn't come easily. Emily stared at the ceiling, her thoughts circling endlessly. Who was Richard Warren, really? Could they trust him? And what was this bigger opportunity he had mentioned? The questions felt like they were closing in on her, their weight pressing against her chest. In the other bed, Joe's breathing was steady but shallow. Emily wondered if he was asleep or simply pretending, lost in his own storm of thoughts. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The next morning, Emily was startled awake by a knock at the door. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was barely 7 a.m. Joe stirred in the other bed, his eyes snapping open at the sound. For a moment, they both just stared at the door, tension crackling in the air. Who do you think it is? Joe asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head. Only one way to find out. She stood and crossed the room, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, Richard was standing there, his expression calm but serious. Good morning, he said, his voice steady. I hope I didn't wake you too early, but we need to talk. There's been a development. Emily stepped aside to let him in, her stomach tightening. Joe sat up on the bed, his posture stiff. Richard entered the room and closed the door behind him, his demeanor more focused than it had been the night before. What kind of development? Emily asked, crossing her arms. Richard took a seat in the chair by the window, his gaze moving between the two of them. After I left last night, I received some information that changes things. It seems someone isn't happy about the choices I've made recently, especially concerning the diner. Emily frowned. Mr. Green. Richard nodded. He's not taking his dismissal well. In fact, he's been making calls, stirring up trouble. And while I don't expect him to cause any real problems, it's a reminder of how quickly people can turn when power and pride are threatened. Joe shifted uneasily. So what does that mean for us? It means we have to move carefully, Richard said. Opportunities like the ones I'm offering you don't come without risks. There are people who benefit from things staying the way they are, and they won't welcome change. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Why would anyone care about what happened at the diner? It's just a job. It's not about the diner, Richard said. It's about what it represents. When you stood up for Joe, you challenged more than just your boss. You challenged a system that's designed to keep people like Joe invisible. And when you do that, it makes some people very uncomfortable. Joe shook his head. I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to get through the day. And you will, Richard assured him. But this is bigger than any of us. It's about creating a world where people like you don't have to fight so hard just to survive. Emily's mind raced. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make that kind of impact. She was just one person trying to do the right thing. How had it all spiraled into something so much larger? What do we do now? She asked. Richard stood, his expression resolute. We stick to the plan. I'll introduce you to the team at the foundation, and we'll start working on the next steps. But you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy. Change never is. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She glanced at Joe, who looked just as uncertain as she felt. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, the weight of what they were stepping into pressing down on them. Let's take it one step at a time, Richard said, his voice steady. For now, just trust that you're not alone in this. We're in it together. Despite his reassurance, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more complicated than they had bargained for. She nodded slowly, bracing herself for whatever came next. As Emily and Joe gathered their things, preparing to follow Richard to the foundation he spoke so passionately about, there was a knock at the door, a sharp, insistent sound that immediately set them on edge. Emily exchanged a wary glance with Joe before stepping cautiously toward the door. When she opened it, two men in dark suits stood in the hallway, their expressions impassive but stern. Behind them, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard stepped forward. Emily, Joe, and Mr. Warren, she asked, her tone clipped but polite. Richard moved to the door, his usual calm replaced with a subtle tension. Who's asking? The woman held up an official-looking badge. Detective Harper. We need to ask you all a few questions about some recent disturbances. Emily's heart sank. Disturbances. What could they possibly mean? She stepped back, letting the detectives into the room. Joe's face paled, and his hands clenched into fists on his lap. What's this about? Richard asked, his voice steady but his eyes wary. Harper glanced at her clipboard before fixing her gaze on Emily. We've had reports about an altercation at the diner last night involving your former employer and some unconventional actions on your part. Mr. Green has filed a formal complaint alleging misconduct. Emily blinked in disbelief. Misconduct? I fed a man who was hungry. How is that misconduct? Harper raised an eyebrow. That's not all. Mr. Green claims you caused a scene, disrupting business operations and jeopardizing the diner's reputation. He's also suggested that Mr. Warren's involvement in your situation is questionable. Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Let me guess, he's painting me as some kind of manipulative benefactor, exploiting these two for my own gain. Harper didn't respond directly, but made a note on her clipboard. We're here to gather facts, Mr. Warren, but given the timing of your sudden interest in these individuals and the claims being made, we have to investigate. Joe stood abruptly, his voice shaking. This is ridiculous. I didn't ask for any of this. All I wanted was a sandwich and a little kindness. Emily didn't do anything wrong, and neither did Richard. Harper studied him carefully, her expression softening slightly. I understand this must be overwhelming, Mr. Thompson, but sometimes even small actions can have unintended consequences. Emily stepped forward, her frustration bubbling over. Unintended consequences. What about the consequences of doing nothing? Of ignoring people like Joe who need help? Isn't that worth investigating? Harper seemed taken aback by Emily's passion but didn't waver. The law doesn't always align with what's morally right, Miss Carter, but we still have to follow protocol. For now, we just need your cooperation. Richard sighed, stepping between the group. You'll have our cooperation, detective, but I suggest you also look into Mr. Green's motives. He's not exactly an unbiased party in this. Harper nodded curtly. We'll be in touch. With that, she and her team left, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. Emily sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. This is all spiraling out of control, she whispered. Joe sat beside her, his expression grim. What if they're right? What if we're just making things worse? Richard knelt in front of them, his voice firm. Listen to me. This is exactly what people like Mr. Green want, for you to doubt yourselves, to give up before you've even started. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. Emily looked at him, her fear mingling with a flicker of determination. So what do we do now? We keep moving forward, Richard said. The foundation is waiting for us, and there's work to be done. Green may have thrown a wrench into things, but he's underestimated what we're capable of. As they prepared to leave, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was brewing, something they couldn't yet see. The stakes were higher now, and the road ahead felt even more uncertain. In the elevator, Joe broke the tense silence. You really think we can win this? That we can take on someone like Green and actually make a difference? Richard met his gaze, his expression unflinching. It's not about winning or losing, Joe. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. As they stepped out into the street, the city felt different, charged with an energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. Emily knew there was no turning back now. But just as they reached Richard's car, another figure emerged from the shadows, a woman Emily didn't recognize, but whose presence sent a chill down her spine. I wouldn't get too comfortable, the woman said, her voice smooth, but laced with warning. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Warren, and it's only just begun. Richard's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The woman smirked. Let's just say I'm someone who knows how this world works, and I suggest you tread carefully. You might not like what you find on the other side. As she disappeared into the crowd, Emily felt the weight of her words settle over them like a storm cloud. The conflict they were facing was bigger than she had imagined, and the path ahead was darker than she had dared to fear. The car ride to the foundation was tense. Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Joe was beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his mind clearly racing. Richard drove with an intensity that matched the growing storm cloud of uncertainty hanging over them. The woman's cryptic warning replayed in Emily's mind, her words circling like a restless echo. When they arrived, the foundation's building stood tall and imposing, its glass facade gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but purposeful. People bustled around with determination, their conversations filled with ideas of change and hope. Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of inspiration despite the unease in her chest. Richard guided them to a conference room, where a group of people was waiting, colleagues, donors, and a handful of individuals who looked just as uncertain as Emily and Joe felt. Richard introduced them quickly, but Emily struggled to focus. The stakes of their situation were still too fresh, too overwhelming. The meeting began with a presentation outlining the Foundation's mission to fight homelessness, create equitable opportunities, and challenge systemic barriers. As the discussion unfolded, Emily started to see how her small act of kindness had stirred something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe she and Joe had a place in this after all. But just as the conversation reached its peak, the door to the conference room burst open. Mr. Green strode in, his face flushed with anger. Behind him was the woman from earlier, her sharp gaze scanning the room. "What is this nonsense?" Green barked, his voice booming. "You think you can use my name and my business to push your little agenda? I won't stand for it." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Richard stood, his expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Green, you're trespassing. I suggest you leave before this escalates." Escalates, Green sneered. You've already escalated it, Warren. Taking in these strays, parading them around like they're some kind of heroes. You're playing with fire. Emily's anger flared. She stood up, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. This isn't about you, Mr. Green. This is about doing what's right, something you clearly don't understand. Green's face twisted in fury, but before he could respond, the woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Enough, she said, her tone sharp. Green, you've made your point, but let me make mine. She turned to Richard, her eyes narrowing. You're not as untouchable as you think, Warren, and neither are they. The words hung in the air, chilling and final. Emily felt her breath catch, her mind racing with the implications. But before she could process what was happening, the woman pulled out a folder and handed it to Richard. He'd opened it, his face darkening as he scanned the contents. Emily leaned forward, her curiosity and fear mounting. What is it? She asked. Richard closed the folder and set it on the table, his jaw tight. It's an attempt to discredit everything we've built here. Fake allegations, twisted narratives, classic tactics to silence change. Green smirked, crossing his arms. You should have left well enough alone, Warren. But now, you're finished. The room erupted into chaos as the Foundation staff rallied around Richard, brainstorming ways to counter the attack. Emily felt lost in the whirlwind, her own voice drowned out by the urgency of the moment. And then Joe spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. Stop. Everyone turned to him, surprised by the sudden command. Joe stood tall, his usual quiet demeanor replaced with a quiet strength. This isn't about Richard or Green or even this foundation. It's about people like me who are tired of being ignored. You want to fight. Fight for that. Fight for us. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with possibility. Emily felt a swell of pride and admiration for Joe, his words igniting something in her that had been building since the moment she handed him that sandwich. Richard nodded, his resolve hardening. Joe's right. We won't let fear or intimidation stop us. Green, you can throw whatever you want at us, but we're not backing down. Green's smirk faltered, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The woman beside him tilted her head, her sharp gaze softening just slightly. She looked at Joe, then at Emily, and for a fleeting moment, something like regret flickered across her face. Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving Green standing awkwardly in the doorway. He hesitated, then followed her, his bravado visibly deflated. As the door closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale all at once. The staff immediately began strategizing, their energy renewed by Joe's words and Richard's determination. Emily sat down, her heart pounding but her spirit lifted. She glanced at Joe, who gave her a small, tired smile. Guess we're really in it now, he said. Yeah, Emily replied, her voice steady. But we're not alone. The battle ahead would be tough, and the path uncertain, but for the first time, Emily felt like they were exactly where they needed to be, and that, she realized, was a victory all its own. In the days that followed, the Foundation buzzed with activity. Richard worked tirelessly with his team, not only to counter Green's smear campaign, but to push forward initiatives they planned for months. It was a battle fought on multiple fronts: press releases, community events, and legal responses. Emily and Joe found themselves pulled into the whirlwind, unsure at first how they could contribute, but determined to help in any way they could. For Emily, the experience was transformative. She had always thought of herself as someone who simply got by, never imagining she could play a role in something bigger. Now, she was helping organize community outreach programs, meeting people who had been through similar struggles, and realizing the power of collective action. Each day brought new challenges, but it also brought a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Joe, too, was changing. At first, he struggled to see his value in the midst of all the action. But as Richard and the others encouraged him to share his story, he began to realize the impact his voice could have. Speaking at small events and meetings, he found himself opening up about his experiences, about the people who had looked past him and the few, like Emily, who had seen his humanity. His words resonated deeply, inspiring others and reminding him that his journey wasn't just about survival, but about finding meaning and hope. One evening, as Emily and Joe walked back to the modest apartment the foundation had arranged for them, they passed a group of volunteers handing out meals to those in need. Emily paused, watching as one of the volunteers, a young woman with bright eyes and an easy smile, offered a warm bowl of soup to a man sitting on the curb. The man's face lit up with gratitude, and Emily felt a wave of emotion. She turned to Joe, who had also stopped, his gaze fixed on the scene. "Funny, isn't it?" Joe said softly. "How something so simple can make such a difference." Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "Yeah, it really can." They walked the rest of the way in silence, both lost in thought. When they reached the apartment, Joe hesitated at the door. "You think we're really making a difference?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Emily smiled, placing a hand on his arm. "We already have, Joe, and we're just getting started." The turning point came a week later when Richard organized a major press conference. It was held in the heart of the city, with reporters, community leaders, and supporters gathered to hear what he had to say. Emily and Joe stood to the side, nervous but proud to be part of the moment. Richard began by addressing the allegations Green had leveled against the foundation. Calm and composed, he laid out the facts, dismantling Green's claims with evidence and testimonies from those who had benefited from the foundation's work. But it wasn't just about clearing their name. Richard used the platform to shift the narrative, focusing on the broader issues of poverty, inequality, and the urgent need for systemic change. Toward the end of the conference, Richard called Emily and Joe to the stage. Emily felt her heart race as she stepped forward, but the applause that greeted them gave her strength. Standing before the crowd, she spoke from the heart, sharing her journey from a struggling waitress to someone who believed in the power of compassion and action. Joe followed, his voice steady as he recounted his experiences and thanked those who had given him a second chance. By the time they finished, the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd's applause wasn't just for them. It was for the idea that kindness and resilience could spark change, even in the face of adversity. As Emily looked out at the sea of faces, she saw something she hadn't expected: hope. The days after the conference brought a whirlwind of activity. Donations poured in, partnerships were formed, and the foundation's initiatives gained new momentum. Green, faced with public backlash and dwindling support, retreated from the fight, his threats losing their power. The woman who had accompanied him that fateful day, Detective Harper, resurfaced not as an adversary but as an ally, quietly assisting the foundation in addressing some of the deeper systemic issues she had seen in her work. For Emily and Joe, life didn't magically transform into a perfect fairy tale. There were still challenges to face, wounds to heal, and lessons to learn. But there was also progress. Joe began working part-time at the foundation, helping with their outreach programs and continuing to share his story. Emily found a new job, one that allowed her to support herself while staying connected to the cause she had come to believe in so deeply. One evening, months later, the two of them returned to the diner where it had all begun. The sign above the door had changed: new owners, new management. Inside, the atmosphere was different, warmer, and more welcoming. They sat at a corner booth, ordering coffee and laughing about how strange it felt to be back. As they waited for their drinks, a man approached their table. He was older, with kind eyes and a weathered face. "You're Emily and Joe, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with gratitude. Emily nodded, surprised. "Yes, that's us." The man smiled. "I just wanted to thank you. I've been following your story. What you did, it matters. It's made people like me feel seen again." Emily felt her eyes fill with tears, her chest tightening with emotion. Joe reached out, clasping her hand as they both nodded their thanks. When the man walked away, Emily turned to Joe, her voice quiet but firm. "This is why we keep going. For people like him. For people like us." Joe smiled, lifting his coffee cup in a small toast. Here's to second chances. Emily raised her own cup, clinking it gently against his, and to making them count. As they sipped their coffee, the world outside the diner moved on, busy and chaotic as ever. But inside, there was a sense of peace, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness could ripple out into something much bigger. And in that moment, Emily and Joe knew they had found not just a purpose, but a place in a world they were helping to change, one step at a time.